All right, so we'll go ahead and get started. Thanks so much for taking your time this afternoon to come hang out with us. My name is Brian Wright. I'm the principal of Town Planning and Urban Design Collaborative and leading the team. You'll see over there, you'll probably hear them too. They're making noise because they're working. So as long as they're making noise, it's okay. We'll try to keep it down over there a little bit. But so we are here to help you all work on updating your zoning ordinance. If we could just quickly go around and do some introductions so we all know each other and get started.
Hi, I'm Claire Morris with TPUDC. I'm the project manager for this project.
I'm Terry Jones. I'm currently a member of the Planning Commission.
I'm Taylor Schaff, Planning Department staff.
Gordon Allen, Planning Department, GIS. Courtney Griffin, Planning Department Associate Planner.
Planning Department Senior Planner.
Jeannie Cooper.
I just think we're okay for now. Actually, the whole time. I haven't tried this way, but- Yeah.
Sunday, please, Mountain Commission. Hello, everybody. I'm Rick Stevenson. I was welcome tonight.
I'm Jackie McDowell, I'm on the board of the Somerville Park Neighborhood Association.
I'm Eric McDowell, and I'm also on the board of Somerville Park Neighborhood Association's president and professor of mathematics at Barrett.
I'm Sheila Shaw. I'm retired, but I live in the FUA Historic District.
I'm Candace Bobby, and I'm with One Community United. Connie Morris, I live in Waynesdale, Georgia. I'm Regina Brown, I'm running for Rome City Commission.
Okay, that's all right. Mark Cochran, Rome City Commissioner and architect at City.
Architect at City.
Today was planning staff GIS.
Great. All right. So the format of these meetings is pretty free form. So it's really just a discussion. We're here to pick your brains, to learn, because you all know this place better than we ever can as outsiders. So we really count on these discussions to teach us, and we tend to have the conversation go where it wants to. I think the topic that was advertised was neighborhoods and housing, so we'll talk about that primarily. Sometimes we'll go on a tangent and hopefully we'll bring ourselves back to that topic, but for anybody who's very much a rule follower, don't get too anxious if we deviate from housing and neighborhoods for a minute, because it's so interrelated in the city, right? Everything's related to one another. So we've heard a few things so far, and chatting with people and doing some research related to housing. So I'll throw these out here as maybe conversation starter. So we have heard there's a desire to preserve a housing stock that provides adequate and attainable housing in diverse types that create stable and viable neighborhoods. Retain the neighborhood mix, retain the housing mix needed for Floyd County workers. Create distinctive, attractive community and a sense of place for South Rome, promotes historic preservation, improvement of housing, and promotes home ownership and concentration of human scale commercial uses at major nodes. Ensure adequate housing is available to meet the needs of Northwest Georgia workforce that's affordable, decent, and safe. Majority of housing units in the county are single family detached, and it accounts for about 72% of the housing stock. 37% is renter occupied. So there's limited amounts of multifamily housing in the county. So nearly half of the rental stock is single family. Let's see, the population here is aging, so there'll be a need for more senior housing, but options for active seniors and those who require more medical care. Encourage upper story housing above commercial uses, I guess is what that means. And creates incentives with sprinklers and whatnot. So there's obviously in those comments that we've heard lots of focus on affordability, workforce, attainability, et cetera, which tends to be the case in meetings like this when we're talking about housing, because those are often the things that are in shortest supply in most communities, especially these days. So a couple of things that I'd like to try to get out of this meeting is focusing on neighborhoods and what does that mean? Because so often when you talk about new development, they're referred to as subdivisions. And when you think about like the older, more historic parts of the city, they're called neighborhoods. And so why do we talk about subdivisions versus neighborhoods based on the vintage of them? And then when it comes to housing, recognizing that there seems to be a shortage of multifamily, but also knowing that that's been a bit of a hot topic lately. How do we address that and anything else related to housing and neighborhoods? So who wants to go first and teach us some things?
Well, I will speak there first and talk about the multi-family housing, and my biggest concern is not to overwhelm the school system. If it's a very large one,
Mhm.
then you have a school system, can it take it on?
Yeah.
That would be a concern of mine.
Okay, good.
May I comment?
Yes, please.
It's my understanding that Rome City School System says they are prepared for whatever. The 500 to 800 unit project that's proposed for East Rome, they've already got plans in place to absorb that, even though they don't exactly know what the mix is going to be as far as who's targeted for the housing. So I think they're on record as saying they can handle whatever as far as the Rome City School System.
Well,
He's correct. He's correct.
and I think the same thing goes for any type of infrastructure in a city, and it's an interesting thing that we find ourselves, time that we find ourselves in these days. That often there is concern about capacity of various things. They say, well, if we do this, then what happens to that? But as with Rome as it is today, in every city throughout the country, as population increase, so does the infrastructure. You do what you need to do. So if you have more students, then you get more schools, right?
Home City Schools is prepared for. We've already talked to the superintendent. That's not a worry.
Yeah, well, and the other thing too is multifamily often doesn't generate lots of students. Just when you have so many single family, that's very student friendly. That said, though, it's certainly something if we're not thinking about making sure that infrastructure keeps up with the population or growth, then we find ourselves having a problem, right? So that's a great point.
Throw it on the table that when we talk about multifamily, we're not necessarily talking about apartment complex.
Yeah,
That's
that's
a
a
very
great point.
white and elitist way to think of multifamily. We're also talking townhomes, row homes, attached single family lofts,
Yeah.
duplexes. So you need to move away when we talk about multifamily in this conversation from quintessential apartment complexes. Thank you.
Yeah, that's a great point. And we talked about in the presentation last night about the idea of character and form, and I even mentioned multifamily a little bit. And you think about some of the most beloved neighborhoods in every city in the country, they had multifamily mixed all throughout them, and it was just normal. But there was a big difference in that multifamily and what we see today. And it's that the multifamily in those neighborhoods are built at the scale of a house, larger houses, sometimes even bigger than any other house, a little bit bigger, but in general, it fit in, the materials were the same, but there was no such thing as a complex of any type, right? You didn't have this idea of a massive number of all the same buildings scattered across a large piece of property that are all surrounded by parking lots, right? And so I think there's two things that happen when we work in cities where there's concern about multifamily. One is everyone is assuming that it's a apartment complex, and it looks like an apartment complex, and that's not in keeping with the character that people care about in the city. The other thing is the perceived crime, different, and people forget. I always ask, I said this last night, ask who's never lived in an apartment before, and there's no one that raises their hand normally in the audience, right? People just forget kind of. And so the way that we like to think about growth, development, and the diversity of housing types is that you're providing housing for people at different stages of life, right? Some people stay in some, often you can equate that stage to an income level, right? And so depending on the person, they stay in a certain stage longer or shorter amounts of time, right? But nonetheless, most people progress through these different stages. So what we want to do is make sure that you have a multitude of housing types, because you end up having a positive impact on things like affordability, and being able to combat some of the, housing shortages. So many places we work there, like, we don't have enough housing. And it's because 90% of the houses in their city are single family detached houses, and so there's some bigger picture things that we have to sort through here, but the comp plan already has given us direction in this regard. So that's good. Now we have to figure out, assuming that, the comp plan went through some sort of a process that, and it was approved, and it was, how do we make sure that if we're going to get multifamily, one, it doesn't overwhelm the system, and two, it's going to be in keeping with and add to the image of the city and the character of the city going forward. So great points.
They've actually had an issue where several. of their
Sorry,
schools-
city county, by the way. That's going to be a problem for me all week. I'm not used to this.
On the county side, they've actually had an issue where some of the schools are shrinking. And
Oh.
at some point you have to question whether or not it's still worth keeping them open, which is never a popular discussion.
Yes,
So and
yes.
I believe they would welcome new students, at least on a certain scale. So,
Interesting.
And is the shrinking due to lack of housing? Or do we know what's creating? the
that I don't have.
shrinking?
We have a
Aging
brain dump,
population.
an aging population, a brain dump in this town.
Mhm.
So they go to school and they move out and they're not bringing their families back. So,
Biggest export.
it
Right.
is. Yeah,
But
it's
we
our
know
kids.
that our larger employers really want their people living in Roman Floyd County. And if we don't have the housing that they need, that's a deterrent. And if we want to grow our population, right? We all want to grow our population. We have to have more housing in order to do that. So what we're seeing is it's around 17,000 people driving in for jobs here. Well, a lot of them would probably choose to live here and be in our schools, which would really help because the county schools, there's funding involved if they don't have certain numbers within those schools. And so it's real important. Well, if you're looking to move to a community and you have small children, you want to be near that school typically. But also there's been a generational shift, right? If I'm a young professional, I don't necessarily come to Roman Fork County or to any community with a ready-made roommate, right? So people are staying single longer. And so I think that looking at what we can offer and the price range of housing is very important. I use my daughter as an example. She's a teacher at Rum Middle last year, and what was available, she couldn't afford. She had to have 2 roommates. Well, she's from here, so she knew 2 people to move in with. But that's not always the case. So I think that housing is needed at every level to support, the kind of growth that we want to see, but also to support our workforce development issues as we're trying to recruit and bring in workers for the jobs we have available.
Well, the other thing to add on to that is the preferences I talked about last night, changing preferences. There are so many people now, and it's a generational thing. Like, they have no interest in a single family detached house or a large yard or any of that stuff. Like, that's completely the opposite of what they want. And so there's this weird thing that happens in communities where when we do a project like this or updating zoning, people get anxious when we start talking about doing something different than is here now, because they assume somehow it's going to impact them. Well, it rarely does, because primarily what we're talking about is new development that's going to occur. If you choose not to move into the new development and to stay in your current house or neighborhood or whatever, it really has no bearing on you. And so as people get, concerned, well, what do you mean we're going to include this or that or the other? Those are the things we have to think about. But you did make one assumption that isn't the case in every city we work in. And I haven't heard something to the contrary here, but I'll just throw it out. And that is that everyone thinks that we should grow and add more people. And so in the places where people are not in favor of that, then we have to teach them about, well, good luck making you not grow, right? And so if everyone's already on the same page with that here, then that's a good thing. We don't have to take that step of explaining to people why you can't stop growing.
Well, because
So-
we do have okay, so I've said this often, I'm 57, I'm at the end of that baby boomer generation. So that's when we're all talking about workforce right now. So we got a huge part of the population that's going to retire out. So everybody has to be thinking about how to grow people to take on the job demands that we have here.
Right. Yeah. No, that's part of, yes. So I wasn't disagreeing, just to clarify. I was just saying a lot of times people don't understand all of this stuff that you just said. And they're like, no, we don't want growth. That means more traffic or more this, more that.
We want growth big
Yeah.
time because they had the MSA change came up last year. where they were gonna change it from the classic 50,000 to 100,000,
Mhm.
which would make us lose our MSA, our NPO, which is our entire department that funds us,
Wow.
and then all of our CDBG funding and all of that. We, thankfully, they decided to do away with that just because there's so many MSAs slightly over 50, but under 100. And we thought we were gonna hit 100 with the census, but we only went up a little over 2,000. We're at 98 now with this current census. So we're hoping we can grow over that 100,000 with the next census in 2030, in case that MSA issue comes back up, because with the way they're pushing it with each election cycle, at some point they're gonna bump it up to the 100,000 threshold. And that's gonna affect all of our funding, which will therefore affect our future infrastructure. And we'll probably get rid of the planning department if we don't have our MSA. So
Okay.
we want growth, we want exponential growth, and that's what we see in the planning department, because we deal with everything before everybody else sees it. We're seeing that desire for growth.
One of the piece to that, it's my belief that we're over 100 now.
The census came out at,
I
yeah,
know what the census said, but I'm just telling you from working in communities
Yeah.
and listening to people talk, no, I didn't do this, no, 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 no.
Yeah.
I think we're over 100. So I think we've got to do a better job next time. We've got to
Yeah.
ensure that we hit those landmarks. But I personally think we're over it right now.
we probably are, but if the government, that $98,000 is still gonna get rid of all of our
I
funding.
understand. I just think we have to do a better job with that.
Yeah.
And
And
I'm
what,
not following that, I'm sorry. Will you repeat what you said? We have to stay over or under?
It's the MSA, that's funded,
Okay,
at a certain point, 100,000, how they were trying to change it this year. We would have lost funding, the city, but not only just city departments would have lost money. It would have affected everything, housing, public, private housing, everything would have been changed. We would have lost
Everything.
everything, it would have been, yes. It
so I'm
would have been
understanding
devastating.
each house needed to be valued at over, am I
No.
understanding?
No,
no,
it's
no,
population
no.
count.
Speak,
Yeah,
yes.
we're talking
Population,
population.
okay.
Okay.
We need to make sure that we grow our population to, on paper, over 100,000. That'd be cool if we were at 150 easily, so.
Yes. Mhm. Mhm.
Okay.
I think there's one more piece when we're talking about housing and the fact that we're an older community. Because of our healthcare, I think we'll continue in that vein. But when you think about housing, at least if I go back 30 years, I think what's affected housing as much as anything is the dynamics of relationships and the different type of relationships which have really affected how people view housing. As he's talking about, folks don't need the big yard, they don't need to be here, they want to be over here. And I think we have to really keep that in mind when we're, sometimes recruiting people into the area, because we lose a lot of folks. If you look at what the school system has, they have to go to get one teacher. And the basis for why they don't want to come along, it involves in our relationships. I think we've got to keep that in mind when we draw up strategies for recruiting, because I see us miss a lot of stuff. I think from a business standpoint, I think a lot of times we miss using our best recruiters. If I need to target a certain demographic, from a recruiting standpoint, you have people, from my perspective, who can fit that demographic to help draw folks. Because we lose a lot of folks simply because I think the wrong people are recruiting. That's another story. But anyway.
I think that's a symptom of the disease. And by that, I mean, the workforce that we're trying to recruit does not think like the workforce that we previously recruited. Millennials will move to a city in Gen Z 2 and then find a job. The reason they'll move to a city is because it's an awesome city. And the reason it's an awesome city is, number one, there is a mass of people that look, think, and want to get out and do outdoor activities. So we're focusing on the wrong thing. For the reason to start with that we needed to scrap the land development code, because it was just an anti-growth document at its core. But in addition to that, we need to be focusing on quality of life, quality of experience things that everybody, I'd throw it out there, over 45 just doesn't really understand to a certain extent. And you get the workers and the workforce here, the city is an amazing place to live. You won't have any trouble with that. And we have for so long gone top down or the other way. So take, for example, manufacturing. Well, if we can get a big manufacturer here, that'll bring 300 jobs, then we'll get the workers. It doesn't work like that anymore. It does not work like that anymore. You ask people, recruiters at Urban, Redmond, Floyd, Barry, anywhere that's looking for people, they cannot find them because the model in this city is flipped upside down. Fortunately, we recognize that. Chamber's doing an excellent job with recognizing that and trying to fix it. I would just, it's very important that everything we do with this land development code, and it can't fix it, but it can help it not make it worse.
Yeah.
Everything we do, we need to be thinking of through the lens of people that we are trying to recruit here and not think the way that we do.
To expand on Mark's point too, we also have a problem where we basically have what I call disposable neighborhoods. And the minute it starts to kind of decline a little bit, it's, well, let's just go another mile down the road and we'll build a new one. And unfortunately, that's led to some very, areas right here close to town that have a great deal of character and have a tremendous amount of potential, but they're decaying. And you also have that issue too. We counted one day, how many vacant lots did we count just between the rivers that you could actually develop on?
I handle the Treatment and Rivers and Historic District. We're currently redoing our survey of it, which I think I told you guys. There's 553 parcels. Of those parcels, 400 and change are housing. There's like 35 green spaces, 40 brown spaces. There's about 150 empty parcels, but you can't tell because they look like side yards. And what also people don't realize about Between the Rivers is there's 9 apartment buildings up there, but they're single family homes that have been reused, which our current code doesn't allow for. But I've talked to Mark before about how I hate that, because as a historic preservationist, I like to buff the mold and I like to reuse these homes, because somebody's going to move out of this $2 million column at some point, and it's going to either sit vacant, it might get sold, or somebody can convert it to 8 row style condos. So,
Well, the good news is that nearly none of what y'all talked about so far is unique to Rome, right? And so as people who live here and, have frustrations about things and all of that, it's normal. And so that's kind of, once we understand and identify what the issues are, then we can easily, like the thing you just talked about, converting to multifamily. That's so easy in the zoning to do that,
get them just to put I know it's our department that we started,
right?
but putting that dot that allows for the special use permit for adaptive reuse of a historic building in a national register district is like, oh God,
right.
I won't do that.
Well, and that's part of what we'll do in this process is one, kind of explain and educate, so like the things that are scary that cause people to say no to something. We'll say, oh, okay, we've got that covered. The thing that I'm worried about, no problem. Now it makes sense. Let's do it. So we'll go through that. I'm also want to point out the idea of who you're recruiting and trying to make a place that people want to be, and it's kind of like this. You think about the types of workforce, employees, businesses, et cetera, that you hope will come here to help you all grow and have the economic benefits you want and have the place that you want. Think about them like wildlife, right? And it's this elusive, endangered species, Well, if it were actual wildlife, what you would do is you would create a habitat that's suitable for that wildlife and it would come, right? And so it's the same thing. This place is the habitat, and you're lucky you already have like the core of this that happens to be attractive to all the types of people you're talking about. And it also works for everybody, right? It's not just like it's a tech worker who makes a bunch of money, but it's also conducive to people who don't have tons of money, right? That's the thing that works well about historic places, because there's a lot of different things. There's expensive restaurants and cheaper restaurants. You can walk if you want to, hopefully there's transportation, public transportation of some type. And so I think as we look at the recruitment side of things, that's a big push, should be a big push, because if you're going to grow, if you need to grow, let's make sure we grow in exactly the way we want to grow, right? But we also have to bear in mind, and even though you didn't say this, I know you weren't intentionally excluding it, you're just making a point. But we also have to keep in mind everyone who lives here too, currently, right? And make sure that we don't create some foreign habitat, some crazy landscape that doesn't work for those who live here. So now we've got all these new people, but nobody else who's already here wants to be here either. And so I think that there was a long time when the way you recruited companies and businesses was making these giant industrial and giant office parks that were seas of parking with these glass box buildings and all that. That worked for the companies in that time, but it actually didn't work for the people who live there. No one goes past their area that has an office park and goes like, oh, this is my favorite part of the city. I love this, right? No one does. We're just at a point now where the habitat for the type of people you're looking to recruit also works well for the people that are already here. And that's really exciting. So we don't have to pick, right? So
to your point too, I mean, we're in a situation now where you can't give away office space. And when we went into lockdown with the pandemic, I was sitting on my sofa with a laptop and people were calling left and right. Why am I paying rent here? Can I just work from my house? Yeah, you're just going to run an office out of your house and you just want to, sit at your computer and make phone calls, knock yourself out.
yeah, well,
One thing about this discussion that's bothered me since it started, actually, and it sounds like in many cases, we're talking about we want growth for growth's sake. And there's a saturation point beyond which, Rome, Floyd County is not going to need more people. And we're certainly not there. And do we need some growth? We probably do. Brittany, exponential growth, I don't know about that. Exponential growth is scary. I don't think we want that. I think we have to be careful about this. Measured growth, perhaps. And you did make a point just a few sentences ago about we need to look at the type of growth that we want.
yeah.
But I think we have to be careful. We don't just simply want growth.
Well, and this is one case where in many communities where we're talking about a growth concept, we say, well, we know at least we have to grow enough to cover the increase of the cost of services over time, right? So that's the minimal amount, the minimal level, because if you don't, then you actually have to increase your taxes to pay for the increase of stuff. So that's the baseline. I would say that there actually is no such thing as a point of saturation. You can look at Manhattan, for instance, right? You don't want to be Manhattan. The only limiting factor would be your preferences as a community for what your character is.
Perhaps saturation was the wrong word.
Yeah, I know what you meant.
Yeah,
I know what you meant, but I think that's one of the main points of this week is to understand what that character is, that is the true limiting factor, because we know we can engineer our way out of anything, we can do whatever, but we want to make sure that it's a comfortable place, the place that you love, that feels like Rome at the end of the day. And so I think getting to the heart of like, what is that character? What do you want to be? But here, because you have this actual funding mechanism that's dependent on a certain population, that's great. Because a lot of times when I'm talking about growth, I can't explain much more than what I just said, the cost of service over time, in any way that people care about. And then you go from there for that minimal level to what is just big enough. We know here at a minimum, we need to be 100,000 so you don't lose funding. And so if you don't go backwards, you actually has a negative impact on you more than normal if you don't grow to that amount. So what is the population right now? Besides the county, 98. So you're not far.
38, the county's 98.
So that's like one new neighborhood.
Probably a little bit more than that.
Yeah.
Give or take, I don't think everybody.
And when we
Yeah.
talk growth as planners, we're not talking quick exponential growth,
Sustainable.
we're talking comprehensive plan periods, 20 years.
Yeah.
Let me go back, and I think a few sentences ago, you did say this, but we have to remember inclusivity. We've got to remember everybody in here, so we've got to be inclusive with our neighbors. So I think that's the key point, because we have to be intentional in that.
Yeah.
That
That's
we
right.
have to be intentional. in
It doesn't
being
just happen on its own.
So, yeah.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Couple of thoughts, maybe more on the practical line I'm thinking of is we have the city and the county, and we have our current plan And there's exceptions. In other words, you can do this in the city, but it doesn't apply to the county. When you
Right.
come up with a unified plan, hopefully it's going to be unified and it applies across the board in the city and the county
Yeah.
instead of having this back and forth exceptions, which is kind of confusing to everybody.
Yeah.
Secondly, the city, and I guess the planning commission, Sunday might know this better than me, but there's a certain amount of development we can do in the city, but the real growth, I think, as far as housing and development is gonna have to come from the county, because that's where the open spaces are. We can do some infilling, we can do some things like that within the city. We can do some restructuring and,
Yeah.
fill in the vacancies that Brittany was talking about.
Yeah.
But
Yeah, I'm like,
if you're looking for land to develop and build housing and whatever that's gonna look like, it's probably gonna have to come from the county.
Yeah.
The majority of the permits for single family residential that go to James Martin's office, building official, are in the county territory, right? And some of those neighborhoods are neighborhoods that were, I think, started many years back or several years back, probably pre-recession or so, and started restarting and so on and everything. But at some point, those developments are going to either stop developing or they're going to fill up. And then the question then becomes, okay, where and what next? And that's been a question with the housing committee in regards to infill development costs. I think everyone talking against that, but I think depending on who you are and your interests, if you will, infill development may or may not be financially feasible for you to either redo or build or buy or rent.
Well, one of the things that I learned recently, I was talking to somebody last night about this. You have the 150 empty lots or whatever in and around the core. And typically what we find is those lots are owned by just normal people, right?
those are owned and trusted. We can't find the owners at least here.
Well, let's say some of them are just
Yeah.
normal people who aren't
I tried to do
developers,
the
right?
research on some of them and I keep hitting a wall.
So when a normal person says, oh, you know what, I see the city wants some multifamily in the form of a cool historic looking apartment house or whatever, and the zoning allows it now, I'll go do that. And then they go and they try to do it and then they look at the cost to do it and the fees and the this and the that and the other. And so at a certain point you find, and I'm just speaking in generalities, I don't know if that's specifically the case here, I've heard it is, but the cost of development it only works for a developer, a development company. And so you only then can get things like complexes and also you have this system. So if you really want to incentivize some smaller scale, more intimate and infill and those sorts of things before we have to go out into the county and on, maybe there are some clever things we can think of to do to help a normal person develop a random lot that they own. That said too, though, if you look at the growth pattern of any city in the country, and it's kind of neat if you have a series of slides and you'll see like there's a little core and there's like a crossroads normally, and then they made a few more streets and they made a few more streets and then it goes out here. And at a certain point, it goes from this thing to, oh, now there's one over here, there's one over here. And all of a sudden, like, we lost like how places used to grow organically. And you went from neighborhoods to subdivisions, and you went from something that seems understandable and rational as a city to something where anything can kind of go, anything goes. And, most of that came from when we started driving everywhere, it was no problem. Like I can get into the core quickly. And then it furthermore came from extending utilities. We'll just put it, we need growth. We want to get to the 100,000. We'll put some utilities out there and things will happen, and they do. Now, the question is, do they happen where you want them to happen? And is the form of that additive to the overall character of the community, or simply just additive to the tax base, right? And so while there is a benefit to tax base increase, there can be a negative, a detractant when you're looking at recruiting these types of people. Because when people come into town to check out Rome or any city, the first thing they're going to do is probably head downtown. And that'll keep them occupied for a minute. And then they'll go, okay, well, where might I live if I'm here? And then they look at the neighborhoods around and they go, okay, there's cool houses here. And then they head out to where the actual housing opportunities probably are for them. And they go, eek, this is not what I was thinking. Now, I say that knowing that probably many of you live in these neighborhoods that I'm referring to. I grew up in the same kind of neighborhoods as well. It was a great life. It was, you know, we had the cul-de-sacs and all the kids played and whatever. But the, so as I say, they say eek. I'm not saying you all should be hating on your own neighborhoods. It's for some people, it's their preference. But as we make decisions, I'm looking at this map here and I see these colors extending off into the yonder. And so we think in the future, is that the right development pattern? Not just do we continue to do more suburban neighborhoods that are single use with lots that are all about the same and houses that are all about the same, but do we just put them here and there and everywhere? Or do you try to focus and extend like you used to in a character that is representative of this place?
Prior to that point, I'm sorry.
You can go first.
I was gonna say, one of the things, and I think there's a session later either today or tomorrow about connectivity, or maybe that will get. But one of the things I know is that looking at these maps pretty much every day is that there are a lot of rights of way that don't connect, literally don't connect. You know, there, we have these half streets and you know, something, I guess, maybe was either planned or something. And so in my mind, I'm thinking if there could be some better, some literal better connections with some of the streets, then that could afford some opportunities for some more infill development. Sometimes the right of way is there, but the actual pavement infrastructure doesn't meet the current requirement and so on. And, you know, that would be, you know, discussion. City or county commission have to, you know, of course, authorize, you know, that to happen. But I think if we want to, if we start looking at, or if we're talking about trying to do some infill development to some degree, we got to be able to make that opportunity work. We got to have, you know, not just water sewer, that's important, but the street infrastructure, you know, needs to be there. We got to have, you know, better sidewalk infrastructure. We have a lot of citizens who are either in chairs or have other mobility issues, or even if they don't, if, you know, if they walk as a primary source of transportation, we need to be able to make that opportunity equal, have equity across the board. Not everyone should have access to a vehicle. And so anyway, I think, you know, some of those things really have to, you know, be part of the conversation. And this is the county too. It's not just within the city limits. So, you know, it's in the county. If Bryce and I were talking about this yesterday, I guess last night or something, you know, we got rights away everywhere that that are unfinished and have been unfinished probably as long as I've been alive. And probably, I don't know if we'll ever get it, but they're there.
Yeah.
You know, they're just kind of, it causes issues too, because when we're doing permitting and everything, there's a right away there. There's a street, there's a frontage setback, so now that causes issues, which could cause a delay in permitting and everything else. And so I think we really need to look at what we have there and see what opportunities are there for some better linkages in order to be able to make some of these other opportunities, you know, happen. Right now, I think that we're kind of stymieing ourselves by not looking at that and finishing out the right of way or closing off and doing something else.
Yeah. Okay.
I don't say as a millennial, we don't build a whole lot of things that I would personally want. I mean, I'm on my third house and we moved where we are because it's easier on my wife's commute to the metro area, Atlanta. And we're out in one of these little neighborhoods where it's, you know, 3 cul-de-sacs and you can walk your dog up to the main road, but you're not going any further because that's basically a suicide attempt if you get out on it, you know, an old country road. And you're just trapped out there. I mean, you can't get anywhere without getting in the truck. And my favorite house that I've ever owned was before I got married. And that was actually the Mill Village. And you were right next to the trails. On Friday afternoon, I could park my truck and I didn't usually crank it unless I want to go get groceries or whatever. I hop on my bike, ride downtown or walk my dog downtown, grab lunch or walk over to the Braves Stadium. And, you know, it was convenient to everything. And
I'm curious about, are you guys working with realtors to hear what they're hearing people asking for? I'm sure you are, you know,
they call,
they call and
Numerous
tell
times
you what
daily.
they need as, and then the developers need to be involved in it, so. But one thing that I see, you say there's an aging population, well, cluster homes are beautiful for that, they like that. But they do like to be
they do
close
have to be
in.
convenient, though. It's a convenient area, so you're correct.
What were you gonna say?
You spoke earlier about multifamily and different types of multifamily, and we all remember multifamily because we all probably lived in at some point. A lot of people, if you think back to your first place that you lived, if it were some house split, you know, in different units or a small apartment complex. The big thing is, so often, if you were to go back to that place today, the zoning that's on that parcel does not allow what you experience.
Yeah.
So a lot of us could go back and look, where I lived in college, no, where I lived between the rivers when I came back to Rome, no, you know, so those were all affordable housing. And when we say we don't have affordable housing, you know, the places that we lived when we needed affordable housing is not available.
Mhm.
One of the biggest things we need to look at when we're talking about our zoning is your favorite spot was Selmies. That's not allowed.
Several Park's a great neighborhood too. It's convenient to everything.
So many parcels in Stonewall Park now, you know, when you think of our current zoning, you wouldn't be allowed to develop Selmies like it was.
That's right.
Some of the lots in Stonewall Park would not have been allowed to be developed like they are. Now, granted, we took care of that lot size. That was one of the biggest issues.
My house in Selma didn't have 60 feet of roof.
That's my point. So often, if you look at places that we all love, between the rivers, CBC, but minimum, I bet a third of the buildings on Broad Street don't meet 26 feet. You know, so sometimes you have to step back after you do all your stuff, and you know, in the appraisal business, occasionally you come up with a number and you step back and take the curve test, you know, and you look at that and say, does that make sense? You know, so the places that we love, the Celanese at affordable housing, the between the rivers, the Summer Parks, the Broad Street, did what we just set up, allow the stuff that we love.
Yeah.
That's been here a long time.
From a taxable value standpoint, you get more bang for your buck out of Celanese or South Rome than you ever do out of some of these nicer subdivisions that have, you know,
Selling these will kill about a farm. You know.
Yeah.
You start taking 4 or 5, $125,000, $150,000 houses and selling these and compare it to one parcel in Battle Farm, it blows out of the water.
Well, and also if you look at it from a tax-based perspective too, when you start looking at some of these mixed-use neighborhoods, mixed-use developments versus, you know, any strip mall, any regular mall, anything on a per acre basis, I mean, it blows it out of the water. But people tend to sort of oversimplify the math or not even do the math, and they say, well, we want to attract the Cabela's or whatever the thing is because that's the new bigger, and that's a retail focused thing. But when you really do the math, you see on a per square foot basis, your downtown, if it's not struggling, you know, is beating it every day, you know.
Joe Minicozy says, that's
Exactly.
right. All you got to do is go to 3rd and Broad. It's our most productive parcel in the whole county.
Yeah.
It's condo development with commercial on the first floor.
Yeah.
17,200 square feet of area at about $21 million per
Also-
acre.
Yeah.
Nothing in this county comes close to that.
we talked yesterday about how, you know, you have to allow for, you know, future growth, and that one, we actually give them a variance to go just a little bit taller than what would normally be allowed. So, you know, you're slowly getting higher than.
Let me say, so the big condo that's got the structural parking in the middle,
Mhm.
because we went through 16 HBC meetings first, we gave them a residential density bonus because they gave us structural parking, just saying.
Why did it take 16 meetings?
Because it's HBC. Yeah, don't go through that. If you want to talk HBC, we'll talk it outside of these meetings.
Yeah.
No, that was not, that was development, but he did get a density, a residential bonus.
Yeah.
You
It's
know,
the most
so,
productive
like it's
parcel in the whole
permeable.
county.
And it
Yeah.
looks so
By
good too.
far.
We know, I think we're talking about, we do need multifamily, but you know, people aren't 27 or 26 and just got, and not married yet, single, soon to be married, soon to have children, and they want to have an affordable starter house. house.
Mhm.
And in 1998, I built a little subdivision out in Emergency Stone Gables, 3.5 acres, 12 lots. And it took, I had to jump out that. It took a while for us to get in variances. Many lots are variance, they're 10th or 8th in the county. You don't see much of that.
Yeah.
I went ahead and put in sidewalks, which unfortunately, like Bryce's place, you walk around the sidewalk and you get to the state right away, and you can get your life taken. We can go 80, but anyway, and those were affordable houses at that time. And now, unfortunately, fortunately, I guess they're selling for, 329, 340 or something like that. Actually, a house that I lived in just sold for that a number of years ago. But that's the last manhole on the county. There's gravity flow. Everything else is pumped there. And we have, in Berry College is kind of a bumper, a buffer. It's hard to cross that barrier to get out past Berry College. It's kind of a barrier for growth because it's just a ways to get past on that. Glad they're here in town. But so I think that we've got to do most of this thing. We have everything we need already in place for infrastructure. We could do infill. And I think there's a lot more than 150 lots available. If I ride around all the time looking. I've been buying stuff in the land bank, and I'm currently down at Old East Rome. I moved my business down there. I'm going to try and do like infill. It's not the most profitable thing, but I also built in post Katrina in New Orleans, the Marrero area. Some places you have where you get to redesign. We do overlay districts. Love overlay districts. Some places, if you start building the same thing over and over again, it steals the soul of the neighborhood.
Yeah.
We're having that happen right now. If it looks the same and it's on every other corner, every other house, we have that happen down in Old East Rome right now. It seems to me that it steals the soul of the community. You say, oh, that's this type of house, or that's that type of house. Instead of having infill done by several park works, because it was developed by a bunch of different people. And that's why it works. That's why it's been so successful. And every time, not everybody's going to build the same. It's a lot cheaper, a lot more profitable to build the same thing over and over. That's kind of a curse of people trying to make money in the building business. So you either do something you're proud of, and not to say you can't be proud of developments, but you either do something you're proud of, or you do something that will stand the test of time, and it doesn't go away. And the old people move out because they moved on to other healthcare, and the young families move in because it's got a small yard, and people can raise their children until they get too big to, they get cars, and you can't have them and their 6 friends with all their cars and pickup trucks parked out in the lawn. So homes change. They have a soul, and neighborhoods, if they are not maintained, the worst blight on neighborhoods is a vacant lot and uncut grass and grown up trees and junk on the side of the road that doesn't get picked up. If we infill and do a proper job, we don't have to buy a bunch of extra seed. We need everything that we should do should encourage the development of existing property in this city and county. And we ought to work with people and make, I'm on HBC, and what Frank said something the other day, they're just guidelines. There has to be some flexibility where we have permission to move a neighborhood, move the need as times change, or else they just become throwaways. And developers, we go outside and we get in the subdivision and we just do our thing because we can predict that margin, and that you can't do that in an old neighborhood where you're doing infill. It's just it's got to be a concerted effort to turn and to revitalize or refresh. Really, that's all we're doing, is we need to refresh some of our older neighborhoods, and that's good for everybody.
Yeah, so tonight, in some of the parks, we're welcoming our pending residents to the multifamily area that was added to our neighborhood. Park.
Yeah.
And that it's just the amount of welcoming and the amount of just good feeling we all have about this.
One of the things that tie a couple of different topics together in one idea. One of the things we see so often is when there is a focus on affordability, there tends to be a lack of focus on character and design. Not because the people who are moving into the affordable houses want that, but it just tends to happen. And I think that it's so funny in communities that have maintained their old mill villages, the old mill housing, those neighborhoods with those tiny, worker houses. I've been out in yours yet, but I assume it's about the same as the other ones we've seen. It has so much more character than nearly any new neighborhood built today. But they were built cheaply. They were built for the workers.
Good houses.
Yeah, and it was like, so you don't even have to, to make something fancy to have it have character. The thing that is neat about these older worker housing neighborhoods is that they were designed to be neighborhoods. The people who built them understood that the workers needed to have a sense of community. It would make them better workers, and they'd show up happy at work the next day because that night they went and hung out with their friends, and there was a streetscape, and they had parks, and they, the buildings addressed the street. They had a clear front door on them, and they're wonderful, and they tend to work well for starter homes and all of that. And so if we can take all of these cool things that you guys already have, we can just walk around and look at it, and that's what we're gonna be doing with our synoptic surveying. Going to go out and measure and document and figure out what's the essence, the DNA of these places that you all love, that are universally loved. Like, unless somebody's just being a contrarian, it's very rare that we hear somebody say, "Oh, I don't like that place that everyone else is saying they like." So we can get there pretty quickly, and then we say, okay, we know we're going to have new neighborhoods. Well, infill, that'd be a priority, but we know we'll have new neighborhoods too. The new neighborhoods should be as if they were like the old neighborhoods, and you follow these same sort of rules and standards and all of that. Now, sometimes just because of the availability of land and the cost of land, et cetera, like you can't, unless you're very heavy handed, you can't control where a new development is going to occur, right? And so it's in a place that you'd say, that's not ideal, but it's, but if you're going to get it, let's make sure we mitigate as many negative impacts as we can. So for instance, if you have a new large subdivision going in, not in the core, it means that people are going to have to drive. And so you're going to increase traffic problems, right? Well, they don't have to necessarily drive everywhere for everything if you give them some of the things that they would drive to normally in that new neighborhood. So like my neighborhood right now, it's new. It is, it's about 3 miles from downtown Franklin, so historic downtown core. It is across the street from Gentry's farm. And so like when you pull into my neighborhood, there's like cows and stuff over there, and a corn maze will be going up before too long when it gets a little colder. But it's 1,500 acres, the development. So it was multiple farms that were put together, and it's permitted for about 3,200 units. But in those 3,200 units, across the street from a farm with cows, and it's not necessarily walkable to downtown Franklin, we have a Kroger, we have a hair salon, we have a Vanderbilt clinic, we have a dentist, we have dry cleaners, we have several restaurants, offices, we have housing of all types, from multifamily to 10,000 square foot mansions on the hill. Everything in the same neighborhood, and it all works well together. It, each thing sort of is harmonious architecturally, and I literally never have to leave my neighborhood ever if I don't want to. There's a school in the neighborhood, an elementary school. There's a preschool in the neighborhood. We have miles and miles of trails through the woods, and miles of sidewalks throughout. There's parks, there's plazas, there's everything is there. Maybe you'd say, that's kind of far out, especially if you're in Nashville, right? You say, well, we're like 20 minutes, 25 minutes from Nashville. And so if you're going to do it right and make it self-contained. And so a lot of places we're working at a minimum are requiring that you can no longer do a neighborhood that's only detached single family houses. You have to have a mix of different housing types. And ideally, you have a mix of uses. So you at least have some sort of a neighborhood center for people to get their kind of typical daily needs met.
How would you characterize the architecture?
In my neighborhood, it is indicative of the local vernacular styles there. So the developer went around and studied to see like what are the typical styles. We have Craftsman and some Tudor and some this and that. And those styles are reflected in the neighborhood. There's some variations on that. So if people wanted to do something that was a little bit, not necessarily a replication of a historic building, that had a little bit more sort of a more modern twist on it, but it still clearly fits right in with something that was historic. And so you could take any neighborhood, any house from my neighborhood and put it in the historic core founded in 1799 in downtown Franklin, and it would fit in.
What's the average square foot of a house?
I can't give you, I mean, I can tell you an average, but it's not going to matter much because if you go from 10,000 square feet down to 600 square feet,
I'm looking at the area of your development.
yeah,
So
It's a ton.
there's a lot.
that still goes back to connectivity, and that development is still at dead ends and cul-de-sacs and roundabouts. And the dead end non-connectivity to, I don't know, 96, is that the highway right there?
Yeah,
Is.
we have two connections tonight,
so
three
you've
connections in
got
96.
Cul-de-sacs and dead ends at every.
We don't have
you
any, there's like a couple of cul-de-sacs in the whole neighborhood.
There's 4 I see right here from the aerial, and then a roundabout, and that's when suburban development doesn't necessarily continue to connect to your Franklin core. When you've got, I think I've heard 3 times, like you gotta get in your car and then drive out to, because you don't want to hit the 80-mile-an-hour traffic with a bike or pedestrian, walkable. And that's kind of the road is your target to connectivity back to Franklin. And when you create those dead ends or in that suburban development, or don't slow down that traffic to 96, that's why I feel like you lose a little bit of the walkability or the bicycle idea to bicycle rather than not drive your car to Franklin. If you don't have a pedestrian friendly road, that's connecting your neighbor to not the main thoroughfare or whatever, that I think hinders people to then connect back down to Franklin or wherever you're at, back down to Rome, back down to Kingston is a really good example of a really cool core. And yet there's, not very many walkable streets connecting Kingston to the rest of our county.
When we're done, I'm gonna have to see what you're looking at because it's not at all.
The 2 or 3 of the goals that I know back up to the hillside where the wooded trails are no longer the development, it's actually other owned land that is.
But all of the streets that go to throughout the whole neighborhood, every street has sidewalks on both sides, street trees, on-street parking. The streets that connect into Highway 96, there's a light at one of them, stop signs at the others, and there's a multi-use trail that takes it all the way into Franklin. So you literally could, and I've ridden my bike into downtown Franklin. I wouldn't do it much because it's a little bit of a hill. But to that point, all the streets in the neighborhood are super, super ultra walkable throughout. So
Okay, but we're talking about Rome right now, right? You're not talking about Rome.
it could be
But
Rome.
we should be talking about Rome.
It could be Rome.
But I think it's important, and I want to echo your point, connectivity by bicycle or by pedestrian ways, I think needs to really be in the forefront whenever we're going forward with the planning for Rome. Lately, we've had some of that. It's been very slow going. I remember them talking about this 10, 15 years ago, and it's just now starting to take place. Gosh, I would like to see that happen on a very intentional, thoughtful basis.
That's gonna take a.
10:30.
What's that?
Tuesday at 10:30.
Yes, I know. I'm so excited about that. Yes,
Just
and
so you
coming through
know,
Somerville Park.
That's gonna take a lot
Our
of communication,
transportation
and a
is
lot
right
of
here.
development,
Yeah,
discussions
those
with
trails
developers,
connect.
who's
She's the most
gonna pay for,
underutilized employee
that
in
kind
the
of
entire
stuff.
city. They don't use her on the development committees. Look at
What is it?
activity. She is not in the ULCC period. The NPO and ULCC is like
Bike-
2 more
bike paths and
commandments.
that kind of
They
stuff.
don't
Some of
connect
it's
it
gonna
away.
pay
and that's just
Y'all
right.
require sidewalks in
Was
new
he talking about a
neighborhoods?
specific one?
I
think
believe
over in the
new
Somerville
construction
area.
requires new
I
sidewalks.
think she's perfect
And-
better.
And I would like to see new sidewalks in Somerville Park as well.
Neighborhoods also. you know, sidewalks would be very, much more connectivity.
Right, and yeah, sidewalks were not required whenever those, whenever Somerville Park was constructed 100 years ago. And,
Right.
that wasn't but it would, I think,
That would enhance.
much of Somerville Park would allow for sidewalks, and I'd love to see that put in there, and I'd like to see that go in every neighborhood.
Right.
My old neighborhood, the Mill Village, it was actually one of the first in the county to have sidewalks. But if you look at it, because so many of those houses, they were built before most people had cars. Now most people do park along the street. Well, that in itself is a street calming or a traffic calming thing. So the sidewalks are rather irrelevant. So they're there and that's great. Nobody really uses them because I'm just stepping between two cars if the car's coming, and you're going to drive slow through there, or you're going to, it's like pulling into an embassy, you're going to go through, but it's almost like security just about.
Well, and that brings me to something I wanted to talk about also, is that when it comes to neighborhoods, it's not just the design of the houses that makes the neighborhood. It's the design of the streets.
Absolutely.
In that public realm. And so what we most often find in nearly every city we go to, there's a disconnect amongst the departments. And we have, the comprehensive plan says walkable, bikeable, mixed use, all the things we've been talking about. And the planning department says, yes, that sounds great. But it tends to be the case that in most cities that engineering and public works are still operating with a more suburban model. And so streets are designed too wide because they're, the edict has always been moving cars, let's move the cars. And so now we're saying, let's make it more walkable, more pedestrian friendly. So we're attracting that habitat thing, we're attracting people to the street. And all of a sudden now we've got a street that's still really just focused on the cars. And so now we're creating a more dangerous situation. We often also have issues when it comes to emergency services. So like, well, we've got these gigantic vehicles, we need to get around the corner when there is an emergency. And so the design of the streets becomes crucial, and we know how to address all of the issues that I just mentioned, the concerns from the different departments. The question becomes, can everybody get on the same sheet of music enough so that we can really design and create these new neighborhoods that check all the boxes? And so I don't know yet. I haven't dug into it much here. I mean, is everybody on the same page?
Well, just a quick time check and a good
Thank you.
segue to let you know that we do think about all these things holistically, but we have to break them up into meetings because it would last several days and no one would eat. So there is a streets and connectivity meeting on Monday at 10 a.m. We're happy to talk about a lot of these things in all of the meetings, but this one has come to its time. The next meeting is in 25 minutes for architecture and design, if any of you would like to stay. And we're also open every day from 9 a.m. to 7 if you ever want to come in and talk longer about these things. But we do try to keep kind of on the schedule.
Yes,
Would
thank
there be
you.
a time to talk about commercial? What would be the best time to want to talk about that?
How about
Land
now?
use and
We can do it real quick because you're here.
Right.
So
And so, 2 years ago, Somerville Park we battled hard against a 3-story, 50-unit sleep-in hotel that was going to be constructed at the entrance, one of the entrances of our neighborhood, literally feet from the property of an elderly woman who's been there for years, in full sight of a number of, anyway, it was a mess. And the guy bought the property. It was already zoned appropriately for the construction of that. Shouldn't have been.
How large was the hotel?
It was going to be 3 stories, I believe, and 50, I think it was 50 rooms, if I'm not mistaken.
Okay.
Yeah, something
So kind of
that.
like a boutique
Large parking
hotel.
lot. It was
Not
gonna-
that-
No,
nothing
it was
to
a
speak
sleep
about.
in.
Okay.
Sleep
Sleep
in.
in.
Sleep in, okay.
Did it front Martha Berry?
Yes.
I don't think I'm familiar
Well,
with that
it didn't
term.
front Martha Berry. It was
It's a brand.
the side of it on Martha Berry.
Never heard of it.
Charleston Street, which was, yeah.
I'm like,
Anyway, we
okay, not
after a
boutique.
large battle and a lot of talking and some very clever work on the part of one of our commissioners, that didn't happen. And we were very proud of that, but it shouldn't have been a problem in the first place. And I'm so concerned about something like that happening again.